A Commitment 2016 special, presented by WMUR and the New Hampshire Union Leader, and in partnership with the New Hampshire Institute of Politics, the Granite State Debates. Tonight, the Republican candidates for the 2nd Congressional District.
And good evening, everyone, and welcome to our live Granite State Debate Series. I am WMUR Political Director Josh McKelvin, and tonight we are joined by the Republican candidates for Congress in New Hampshire's 2nd District. Let's go over the format real quick, the rules of this debate. Each candidate will have a brief opening statement followed by questions that I'll be asking as well as our panelists. Answers will be limited to around a minute. Rebuttals will be allowed at my discretion, and the candidates will also have a closing statement as well. So let's learn a bit about the candidates, starting with State Representative Jack Flanagan. Jack Flanagan was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and graduated from Boston University. He also has an MBA from Southern New Hampshire University. Flanagan has worked in the insurance industry with a focus on financial management and software design and implementation. He has served as a town selectman, school board member, and town finance committee member. He is currently in his 3rd term in the New Hampshire House. He has 3 adult children and lives in Brookline. Representative Flanagan, your opening statement, please.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you, WMUR. I want to be in Congress so I can improve people's lives, provide more opportunities for them. And as a legislator, we're able to see that with good legislation.
All right. Our second candidate tonight is former State Representative Jim Lawrence. Jim Lawrence was born in New York City and graduated from the Air Force Academy. He served in the U.S. Air Force before becoming a contractor specializing in streamlining projects for the Department of Defense. He's now the principal at a Nashua-based consulting firm that does the same as a private company. Lawrence served 3 terms in the New Hampshire House. He lives in Hudson, is married, and has 8 children. And Mr. Lawrence, it's your chance for the opening statement.
Washington is broken. Representative Custer does not vote for the people of New Hampshire. I served 3 terms in the State House. I'm a veteran and a small businessman. But more importantly, I'm a proud parent of 8 children. And I couldn't stand by and look them in the eye knowing I did nothing while Washington spent their future prosperity away.
All right, thank you, candidates. Now let's meet the folks on the panel. Dan Toohey is reporter for the New Hampshire Union Leader. Adam Sexton, our political director here at WMUR. Reporter, actually. Just promoted you. Allie Morris, she reports for the Concord Monitor. They'll be asking the questions. And we're going to start, though, with something that's kind of important to win elections, and that's name ID. According to latest polls, 3/4 of the voters in New Hampshire don't know who you are. Your campaigns are not very well funded, at least comparatively speaking, with the incumbent. But the question is, how do you make the case to voters who are clearly thirsting for something else, something different? You're that person. Mr. Lawrence, we'll start with you.
Well, I would add, Josh, that the polls aren't all bad. The polls do show that they're looking for something different than Representative Ann Custer, which is why my candidacy is actually in a statistical tie with her, and I'm actually outpacing her amongst independent voters as well. And I might add that I'm running a very strong grassroots campaign that's been received very well over the entire district. I've received a whole host of endorsements, including the endorsement from the Union Leader saying that I'm the clear choice to go up against Ann Custer in November.
And Representative Flanagan, why are you the choice?
The point I suppose one would have to look at is what we have now and what the perception of the public is. Mrs. Custer, Annie Custer, has basically been ineffective in Washington, D.C. And I think people want change. They want improvements in their lives. They want to be working again. And the current process that we have is broken. And the reality is I think over time, once they get to know me, they'll realize that there are good policies that can be driving to improve people's lives, like I talked about in my opening comment.
All right, thank you, candidates. Let's go to our panel now. First question, focusing on the top of the ticket, that's coming from Allie Morris of the Concord Monitor.
Hi, welcome. So both of you have said that you support Donald Trump's candidacy, and just last night he said that Vladimir Putin was a better leader than President Obama. Do you agree? And Representative Flanagan, we'll start with you first.
I don't know Vladimir Putin all that much. The one thing that I do like is that Donald Trump knows Vladimir Putin. In other words, they're basically the 2nd strongest power in the world. So by having a relationship going into a presidency, I think it's nothing but a good thing. There has been a number of Democrat pundits criticizing him for talking to him. Well, talking to foreign leaders is how we make positive results in people's lives. So he can say whatever he wants to say. The reality is what the policy comes forward, and if they can talk to each other, I think that's a great thing.
Same question for you.
I support Donald Trump for the simple reason that Donald Trump's vision for America is more in line with what I think is critical for us to move forward. I'm not going to agree with everything that he says, but he is certainly more in line with me than Hillary Clinton. And I want to also add that I hope that this panel will ask the Democratic candidates as well what they think about Hillary Clinton and her indiscretions, because I'm running for Congress to represent this state, not to represent Donald Trump.
Right now we're doing the Republican primary debate for the second CD, but the question was about Vladimir Putin. Do you think he's a better leader than President Obama?
You know, right now I think Russia has been doing some things that is puts American interests in jeopardy. They've been flying their fighters low and fast over our naval ships in the open seas. They've been threatening to create more incursions into places like the Ukraine, which are our allies. I'm not going to give more support to Vladimir Putin at this time. I think he's a threat to national interests.
All right. Next question coming from our panel, Dan Toohey on immigration.
Thank you, Josh. Question for you, Mr. Lawrence, first. You both agree that the border should be secured, but what about the 11 million undocumented illegal immigrants in the country now? What is your plan specifically to deal with these people?
Well, I believe that you are correct that we do need to secure the border first. I've said this time and time again. It doesn't make sense to talk about trying to deal with immigration reform or address an issue of illegals that are here until we secure the border. That's why I came up with a plan that said we should build a wall or fence where practical, augment that with electronic countermeasures, and augment that with manpower. That is the quickest and most efficient way to secure the border. We need to do it now because it is a security risk to the United States. And I don't believe that we should enter into the dialogue about discussing anything else that deals with immigration until you secure the border. Because whether you believe in mass deportation or not, if you don't secure the border, we can't prevent them from coming back into the country.
Representative.
Quick follow-up. Are you against a pathway to citizenship of any kind?
I would not be for a pathway to citizenship or amnesty until we secure the border. As far as I'm concerned, it's off the table.
Same question for you, Representative Flanagan.
Thank you for the question. And as the former majority leader, I dealt with policy all the time. It's really a five-part response. Obviously, secure the border. We have to enforce the existing law. H-1B visas, we need to take a look at how and the numbers that are coming into the country, if they're going to be legal. Okay, do we need additional talent in different areas? Most immigration is based on an economic reason. We need E-Verify, okay, and the sanctuary cities. All five of those things are going to have effect on whether or not people will, dare I say, self-deport or get in line and become citizens of this country.
All right, moving forward, let's talk about national security a little bit. One of the topic of online surveillance has been in the news a lot lately. It's gaining attention in the wake of several recent domestic terror attacks in this country. Where do you draw the line, Representative Flanagan, on what the government should and shouldn't be able to investigate? We're talking about an individual's online profile.
Sure.
And other activities for signs that he or she may be planning something that be harmful to Americans.
It's obviously it's a First Amendment issue. And the other thing being is that URL codes, and again, I'm not a technical person, but I do know that every time your computer goes somewhere, it leaves, shall we say, fingerprints. So whether I'm looking at buying a car or looking at a terrorist site, those are all things that marketing people have access to, especially the cars, not the terrorist thing. But I think as part of dealing with ISIS, it may be looking at social media in a way that we might be able to preempt any strike domestically by using social media review.
So whatever can be done should be done.
Absolutely. There's more to it, but you asked a question just on social media.
Yes.
So I would agree that we need to look at it a little bit further.
All right, thank you, sir. Same question for you, Mr. Lawrence.
Being a veteran myself and also the son of a 35-year law enforcement veteran, this is definitely a subject that's near and dear to my heart. The one thing that I want to really nail home here is that the first and foremost thing we need to do is make sure that we're following the Constitution. I would not be in favor of trading away American civil liberties or their freedoms that are constitutionally guaranteed for the sake of safety. But that being put aside, once we've ensured that, then yes, I would be in favor of taking prudent measures to allow law enforcement to identify and target threats to the safety of America.
Just a comment too is that I do know that anytime you're looking into like phone records and so forth, it does have to go through a court for adjudication. So I would agree that this should also, before we just unilaterally do it.
So move carefully.
Yes.
All right, thank you, candidates. Next question comes from Adam Sexton on ISIS.
Thanks, Josh. Let's talk about the ongoing humanitarian disaster in Syria. Instead of accepting thousands of Syrian refugees into this country, Representative Flanagan, you've said you want Americans to build and guard a safe haven within the country of Syria to protect innocent people. Mr. Lawrence, do you think that would work?
Thank you for that question, Adam. You know, as a veteran, I just can't see a path to victory with that particular scenario. I mean, no matter what you do, if you send military troops into Syria now, you're going to be pinched in between the Russians in the north and the radical Islamists on the east. And there's no way other than to force a safe zone with American troops, putting our troops' lives at risk, to accomplish that. And unfortunately, I'm not willing to sacrifice the brave men and women in the American armed forces for police actions around the world. I don't believe that's the proper use of our military.
Mr. Flanagan, it does sound kind of like a circular firing squad there to drop those troops down in the middle of such a dangerous place.
Can I respond to your question?
Absolutely. Yeah. How's it going to work?
Yeah, basically is once the zone is established, this is Governor Kasich had the similar response as it related to Syria, okay? The trouble is do we take Syrians into this country not knowing, unable to vet them to find out who the terrorists are or who are the terrorists, okay? The reality is I would imagine that Syrians would rather stay in Syria if they felt safe. So the point being is you establish the safe zone. Once you've outlined, and we did it in Iran, right? When we, Iraq, we had the north and the south, and there was a no-fly zone. Same thing is that the area would be protected by the military, established by the Army Corps of Engineers, and then allow some training, but also a presence so they can stay in their own country.
Within the same region, gentlemen.
May I have a rebuttal on that?
Sure, take 30 seconds.
The bottom line is this. Iraq was a little different. We had already taken the territory. We don't have any territory in Syria now. So we'd have to fight for that territory in order to expand that safe zone. And I have to take a hard stand on this. As a military veteran, I am sick and tired of non-vets saying they want to put American soldiers in harm's way for police actions somewhere else. The Syrian refugee issue is very simple. We don't have to accept them into our country.
30 seconds to rebut and we'll move forward.
Thank you, Josh. The reality is whenever you look at a conflict or a war, it looks how does it benefit this country? First and foremost, I've talked to many high-ranking officers, and that's what they always look at. In this case, we're preventing them from coming into this country. They're already here. We need to minimize their impact.
All right, Adam.
Let's take a longer view of this issue and the region as a whole. If and when we do defeat ISIS, what can the United States do to prevent the next radical Islamist group from growing up in that region? And this question goes first to Mr. Lawrence.
Well, the first and foremost thing we need to do is take these threats that emerge around the world seriously. 2 years ago when I ran for Congress, I talked about ISIS as being the next threat to the United States. At the same time, President Obama, unfortunately, called them the JV team. We sat back and we allowed them the growing strength. We need to target these groups where they are in the world. If you deal with the situation right when it starts, it's much better off. You're much more likely to deal with that and stamp it out right where it starts. We need to get more aggressive with our fight against terrorism.
Is that not, though, the global policing you were just decrying? You were just saying you don't want to police the world, and yet what would you be doing there?
Well, you're not policing the world. You're actually defending America and our assets. ISIS has already proven that they have been able to spawn terrorist attacks right here on our home soil. They're also creating and sponsoring terrorist acts against our allies. You're protecting us directly from a threat. The Syrian refugee issue is a question of whether we want to accept these refugees into our country or not. That's not directly threatening the United States' safety.
Well, let's take it there. You've made it clear that you don't like Representative Flanagan's plan. What's your plan?
Well, my plan to keep Americans safe, because that would be my first priority,
By bringing Syrians here?
is not to bring anyone over here that's going to pose a national security threat to us. If we bring someone over here, we need to make sure that we have a proper vetting process to ensure the safety of Americans. If we can't ensure the safety of Americans, then I would not be an advocate for bringing them here.
Thank you, Josh. It's unfortunate, but they're already here. The reality is to Adam Sexton, I don't know if you were going to ask me the same question, is that there's a multi-pronged approach to this one also, is that there are countries in the area that need to be reached out to. It's not just us, and as Jim said, defending the world. It would be a coalition. We also need to find the countries that were directly affected that would also come to the plate and help. We have to target the leaders. Okay, if they're looking over their shoulders, and I'm not a big advocate of drones, but if people know where they are and can find them, they may wonder whether or not their lives will be around at the end of the day. So there's a whole litany of things that can be done, and of course safe zones is another one as it deals with keeping them out of this country.
All right, we're going to move forward to another important issue in this race, coming from Dan Tuohy, the Union Leader.
Representative Flanagan, you and your opponent are both outspoken advocates for the Second Amendment. Is there anything at all that would prompt you to consider expanded background checks or any limits on what guns can be sold?
No. I think we should just enforce the laws we have. It's proven that criminals don't obey laws. So what we're really doing is passing laws on law-abiding citizens. For example, constitutional carry, which I shepherded through the State House this year. We had a House bill and a Senate bill. But the long and the short of it is that criminals don't concern themselves whether they carry concealed and without or with a permit. So when you talk about more licensing, it really is affecting law-abiding citizens. So I think what we really should be doing is enforcing the laws that we have.
Mr. Lawrence, same question.
As a lifetime member of the NRA, sportsman, I support the Second Amendment in every other part of the Constitution. I do not believe that we should be picking and choosing parts of the Constitution to follow. We do have background checks on the books currently. We need to enforce the laws that are on the books. But there's one clear distinction with me in this race. I'm the only candidate in this race that has an A rating from all support groups for the Second Amendment. And the reason being is that my opponent has shown a tendency to say something, to talk tough talk when it comes to supporting the Second Amendment, but unfortunately, when it comes to support those issues, he hasn't always been there.
I'm not sure what you want to rebut to, but it's definitely,
well, it was a shot at me, no pun intended.
No, sure.
But the reality is he's filling out surveys, okay? I'm actually introducing legislation, all right? The other thing is, in the House level, and you're well aware of this, Josh, is we don't have metal detectors. And some of our Republican and Democratic members were concerned that they could not carry themselves. I was the one in the Rules Committee in the House of Representatives that allowed them to carry their pistols or arms in the State House to protect themselves because of the situation where there's no armed guards or there are very limited armed guards and there's no metal detectors. So, I mean, you can fill out all the questionnaires you want, okay, but I am not lip service. This was actual legislation.
Let's expand on this, though.
Well, wait a minute. He said I filled out surveys. My grades aren't based on my surveys. My grades are based on my 6 years in the State House. And as a matter of fact, I'm the only member on this stage that actually has a pro-gun piece of legislation that became law. So that's not true. My record is based on my legislation. And for the record, we weren't even close when it came to the gradings because they gave me an A and they gave my opponent a D from the New Hampshire Firearms Coalition. Obviously, I'm not the only one that feels that Representative Flanagan has a tendency to promise big things to the voters and then turn around and do something different.
30 seconds.
I don't know how you can turn around. I mean, there were two bills. I shepherded the Senate bill through the House and the governor vetoed it. I mean, I don't know how much more you can do. And then in the House bill, we pulled it out of the drawer. There was a strategy involved. to get the law passed.
All right, let's
So-
move forward. Let's move forward. Next question comes from Allie Morris of the Concord Monitor.
So you mentioned your legislative record, so we're going to ask some questions about that. First to you, Mr. Flanagan. In a Republican-controlled legislature this past year, 2 of the 23 bills that you sponsored or co-sponsored became law. One was a proposal that allows passenger vehicles going less than 15 miles an hour to coast downhill, and another requires the state notify a child's school of a change in placement if they're removed from their home.
Absolutely.
So the rest were tabled, sent to interim study, or killed. Many never made it out of the House. Is that the record of an effective legislator?
Sure. Let me go back to the bills that you referenced. One was the coasting bill. That was a freshman legislator. He came to me with the idea, and his goal was to get a bill passed. And I was more than happy to co-sponsor that, because if you really think about it, automobiles have changed. That law was antiquated anyway. He needed to feel as though he was achieving something. So I was, in essence, helping him. Okay. The other bill dealing with foster children literally changed the lives of foster children for decades. What happens is the only stable part of a foster child's life is school, and the schools were never involved with the transfer. The courts would order DCYF to go in and just remove the children. Children were going to Christmas parties, and they were removed. They didn't even get their gifts. So this bill I'm very, very proud of. And as it relates to other bills, there are hundreds of bills that I would put my name on because of being the majority leader to help shepherd them through. But the reality is I can only put in so many bills because there's 800 that I review.
All right, it's time. Move forward.
Mr. Lawrence, in your 3 terms as a state representative, you sponsored or co-sponsored 14 bills. One that became law allows people to shoot deer with a .50 caliber handgun, one of the most powerful pistols that exists. How does this record qualify you to be a congressman in Washington?
Well, quite frankly, I don't think that's the record that qualifies me to serve in Washington. What qualifies me to serve in Washington is the breadth of experience I have. Being a veteran, a graduate of the United States Air Force Academy, a small businessman, a 3-term legislator, and yes, a 3-term legislator that voted on thousands of bills to protect taxpayers' dollars and resources, protect their Second Amendment rights as well as all other constitutional rights, as well as fighting for veterans' rights. I want to add that the 3 veteran bills that I proposed, even though they didn't pass when I was a freshman legislator, they all became law by the time I left, and I'm proud of that fact.
Just curious, why it was important to you to pass legislation to allow deers to be hunted with a .50 caliber handgun?
Well, to be honest with you, Josh, it's already legal to hunt large game with handguns. There was a particular caliber that was excluded, and this is particularly important for some of our the group of individuals that are hunters that may be handicapped, that can't carry a rifle. They should have the opportunity to hunt as well. And it's called a pack rifle. It's a pistol, but they call it a pack rifle. And it enabled some people who aren't able to use a rifle to hunt deer.
I see you gesturing to weigh in, but you weren't invoked, so we got to move forward.
I just,
we got to move forward.
I don't know. My first thought was, what makes that type of legislation changing the face of New Hampshire and/or Washington D.C.? So that's all.
Would you like to respond?
Well, I mean, the reality is that the veterans bills that I proposed and became law definitely changed the face of New Hampshire. It included veterans that were post-Vietnam era, and a lot of the being recognized and enjoying some of the benefits of veterans in this state. We should be standing up for our veterans, whether we're in the State House in Concord or in Washington, D.C.
We're going to do a Facebook question. This one is coming in from George Hoyt of Milford, and he writes, James Madison wrote in Federalist 51, "But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature?" Respectfully, candidates, do you believe the ideological purity contests in American government are the greatest of all reflections on human nature in regards to our government? Mr. Lawrence.
Can you repeat that again?
Are you going to make me?
Well, I know George, and thank you, George, but okay, you can answer that one first.
You know, I'm running a strong candidacy because Washington is broken. Washington is broken in no small part to the people that we've decided to send down to Washington, D.C. So an individual's moral character, their fiber, is definitely something that should be considered. And I believe that government is a reflection of the people. So I'm hoping that the people of New Hampshire are paying attention, because it's time for us to send new effective leadership to Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Lawrence.
I think Jim's very moral. He's got 8 kids. I mean, I can't fight he's a great guy. I said, but I think the question really deals with the ideology, especially in the parties. And you can't be too conservative. Or you can't be too liberal as a Republican. And that's the problem, I think, with what we currently have now. The reality is are we helping our constituents? Are things getting better in their lives? Can government fix things or make them worse, these unintended consequences? But I don't think one size can be used, that is ultra-conservative or ultra-liberal, is the solution. I think there needs to be bipartisan approach without losing the principles that we have, that is Republican principles: smaller government, more efficient, growing the economy.
All right, technically, Mr. Lawrence, you were invoked when he called you a great guy, but you don't need a rebuttal for that, do you?
I don't need a rebuttal for that, but
Okay.
I would just like to add one simple point. No one's going to argue the fact that we shouldn't be cooperating with both sides of the aisle to solve problems. The top priority of any representative from this state should be to solve problems and create solutions for the people of the state of New
You
Hampshire.
seem to agree on that point. All right, next question coming from the panel.
The question for both of you, we'll start with you, Representative Flanagan first. Both of you have pointed to the nation's debt as a critical threat to the country and a top priority if elected to Congress.
Correct.
So what specific area of government or department would you target for elimination or reduce spending?
Well, I think the first thing is regulations. I mean, they're so onerous on businesses right now that one is that they're driving them out of the country, that in our tax policy. The other thing is the balanced budget itself. When we're spending more money than we get in, it affects every business, that is from a borrowing standpoint. But I think there's a multiple factors as it relates to the economy. But the debt in 10 years will be the second largest expense in the budget. And we have debated, Jim and I, about Social Security and things like that, where the most important thing is to get fiscally solvent. And it allows us to do a lot more things than we normally would do based on running deficits.
Spending side of the ledger, though, anything you can identify that you would?
Well, I mean, there are 438 agencies. Almost, I think 10 of them deal with efficiencies. So let's get rid of those 10 and have one department that's efficiencies. We can change a lot of different agencies and make them more efficient.
All right, Mr. Lawrence.
Washington has a spending problem. We all know this. I don't believe that you should target one specific part of the federal government to cut. I might add that I am the only candidate that has over 2 decades of federal budget programming and planning experience. And that experience has taught me one thing. There's room to grow. There's room for efficiencies across the board. So I don't think you should take any agency off the table. You need to look hard at every single agency in the federal government and make prudent cuts wherever you can. And I might want to add, since Representative Flanagan brought up our differences in Social Security, one clear difference between my plan and my opponents is that I acknowledge that Social Security is funded and should be funded separately. And I don't believe that solving the overarching deficit spending issue is necessarily the answer to solve Social Security. More needs to be done.
Okay, you 30 seconds.
But when you pay your Social Security taxes, it goes to the Department of Treasury. It goes to the general fund. It doesn't go to this magical trust fund, Social Security trust fund. It goes to the general fund, and then, of course, it's fed into the Social Security. The problem that we have is there's less and less people working as we get older. But there's also a problem in the economy itself. Is that people, I think the age group from 50 to 60 creates a lower income level for that group, which are then to be funding the people that are retired. So it's an ongoing problem.
Okay.
Well, one distinction is
Mr. Lawrence, we got to move forward. He didn't invoke you, so we got to move forward. Next question coming from
one
Allie.
point that he
Mr.
talked
Lawrence.
about,
Mr.
one of my
Lawrence.
key platforms, which is to separate the funds that are collected for Social Security. That is the problem why we are in this mess now, because Congress keeps dipping into the Social Security fund and spending the money. We have to separate and fence that funding off.
It doesn't exist. The money goes into the general fund and they fund. It's by law. They have to fund.
And that's why if I go to Congress, I will fight to make sure that doesn't happen.
All right, Mr. Lawrence, we did agree to the rules of the debate, so let's try to stick to them. Next question is coming from Allie Morris, the Concord Monitor.
So obviously the Zika virus is on a lot of voters' mind. If you are elected to Congress, how much money should be appropriated to fight the virus from the federal government? And where does that rank on your list of priorities? We'll start with you, Mr. Lawrence.
Well, you know, we currently suffer from a drug crisis in this state. And I was very disheartened to hear that the federal government was looking to divert funds that we vitally need to fight the drug crisis to fight Zika. I'm not saying that there's not an issue there that we shouldn't be addressing, but we shouldn't be robbing Peter to pay Paul and sacrificing the lives of New Hampshire citizens who are struggling with drug addiction. Zika is a priority. I put it below the drug crisis that currently exists in this state.
How much would you appropriate for it, and where would that money come from if it's not coming from substance abuse money?
Well, I would be remiss if I told you that I could come, off the top of my head with the right figure to fight Zika. I'd have to research that issue and identify the proper amount of funds and a funding source to do that. Right now, though, I think our focus should be the drug crisis.
Representative Flanagan.
Thank you, Ally. First of all, there's money left over from Ebola. That is, I think the contention in Washington, D.C. is that why are we funding Zika when we still have money there? And the reality is it's focused in the southern part of the country, the southeast, Florida, possibly Georgia. And I also understand that there's a vaccine that's very close to coming forward. So judging all of that, the fact that there may be existing monies and it's limited in its area, thank goodness it is, that it would be minimal amount that may be needed when you supplement it with the monies left over from Ebola.
Right.
Politicians have a way of spending money anyway, so let's use it the right way. Sorry, Josh.
Let's change pace a little bit. It's all right. Lightning round to keep the answers brief. Yes or no would even be better. Get you on record on a couple of different things here. First, transgendered bathrooms. Should public schools allow students to use the bathroom with the gender that they identify with? Mr. Flanagan.
No, and Jim, no, also. Now, if you want to build, and I know it's yes or no, but
Kind of lightning, but go. Real
okay,
quick.
if you want to have a separate bathroom, single stall, that type of thing, I'm okay with that.
No.
All right. Next question is Citizens United. Keep it, get rid of it, what?
The decision?
Yes.
Well, it's based on the Constitution, and I've said time and time again, I support the Constitution. So until we change the Constitution, yes.
But do you think it needs to be overturned?
No, because it's, the Supreme Court has weighed in and said it was based on the Constitution.
No, I don't think it needs to be overturned either.
And lastly, if you were the commissioner of the NFL, would you discipline 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick for refusing to stand during the national anthem in protest? First one to you, Mr.
It
Flanagan.
depends what's in his contract. I know they all have a union contract, and they would
He
have
has,
to.
he has unilateral authority to do that, as we know here in New England.
Okay, no, it's a freedom of speech issue.
All right.
Freedom of speech issue, I think he was wrong on Tom Brady. He'd be wrong to do that too.
All right. Next question. Send it back to Adam.
Thanks, Josh. Similar topic, race relations and policing, a difficult topic, but an important one. Let's say you're both on a road trip in a major American city and you get pulled over for a broken taillight. Representative Flanagan, is it fair that if you're behind the wheel, you might be treated differently than Mr. Lawrence?
I'm not laughing at the situation. It's just
The road trip, you guys.
Yeah, well, he got me laughing.
Oh, you
I
gonna
would
blame me?
I would. Yeah, right.
But is it fair, though, that you might have a different experience than he
No,
would?
I would hope that it wouldn't happen. And I give police a lot more credit because they're professionals. As a selectman in my town, and when I hired my chief of police, I made sure that we followed community policing, that they would treat citizens and anybody they encountered on the roads the same way that they would want to be treated. But in any area, even politics, you get a few bad apples. So I'm going to say and hope that we would be treated the same way.
Mr. Lawrence, what can be done to perhaps change that 1 out of 100 situation where it is a negative interaction between an African-American person and a police officer?
Well, I want to first and foremost say, as the son of a 35-year law enforcement veteran, and it just so happens that my father was one of the pioneers for community policing, which is what Representative Flanagan just referenced. I do believe that community policing will go a long way to solving a lot of these problems. But the most important thing I think people need to understand is that the overwhelming majority of law enforcement officers do their job very well to keep us safe every day. There's a few bad apples there, but the overwhelming majority of police officers are excellent.
Mr. Lawrence, you've said that President Obama has actually made this problem worse rather than better by inflaming racial tensions. I guess in what sense do you think the president has failed on this issue?
Well, I think what the president has done, unfortunately, is he's continued to fan the flames of racial hatred instead of highlighting the things that unite us. He's made inflammatory statements that have emboldened Black Lives Matters, and we just talked, both of the candidates here on the stage talked about the importance of community policing to solve some of these issues. It's very difficult to enact effective community policing when the community and the police department are at odds with each other. It's unfortunate that Snoop Dogg was more on point than President Obama, because right after the Dallas shootings, he had a press conference with the LA police chief talking about the importance of coming together.
All right. Same question for you, Representative Flanagan. What can be done to repair racial discord?
I think it does start at the top. I think we have to understand the differences. But at the same token, too, is I don't think being a police officer, Jim talks about his father being a police chief, but my great-grandfather was shot in the line of duty. So it is, I think, a very defensive job to be a police officer. So every day they risk their lives. I think it does create a attitude, a defensive attitude, not a bad attitude, but going into a situation where they may have to use a revolver. So it may change the way they view things.
Thank you, candidates. Shift gears now. Again, back to Adam Sexton on the panel.
Representative Flanagan, if you're elected, will you spend any time at all focusing on the issue of climate change?
You know, thank you for the question. I'm a very inquisitive person. There was a professor at UNH that is renowned about climate change, and I think his studies deal with borings into ice. And I tried to reach out to him, I can't remember his name, because I'm one of those people that know climate does change, but I don't necessarily agree with some of the reasons for it. But, and I think you've known me for enough years that I want to know all the facts. I don't think any good opinion or good decision comes in a vacuum. So I'm not going to advocate for legislation, but I'm always willing to listen to the other side or somebody's position going forward. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think the more information you have on any subject goes a long way in making decisions in the future that have very little or no unintended consequences.
Mr. Lawrence, will you spend any time at all looking at this issue?
You know, being a small businessman, I know firsthand the regulations or the impact of overregulation on small businesses. We have to protect our environment, but we need to balance protecting our environment with the cost to business. Right now, unfortunately, small businesses particularly are suffering under overregulation. A lot of them are holdovers from a time when most people don't even understand why they are there. So no, I would not support any additional regulation for any cause whatsoever unless there are specific facts and scientific evidence to guarantee that it has to be done to save the environment, and also balancing that with the economic needs. I mean, we had 8 years where the highest growth rate was 3%. That's the worst in American history. It's got to change.
Northern Pass, the energy project, would be in the second CD. Let's get you on record. Are you in support of it, Mr. Lawrence, or no?
I'm against it because it's not a good deal for the citizens of this state.
Okay, Mr.
We need the energy. The only thing that I would be concerned about is that all the people get heard. This is different than the Kinder Morgan project, which was underground and there was eminent domain issue. A lot, if not all of the easements are actually owned by Eversource. But there is the view issue. I do know that there is a preferred price plan too. So we are going to get something from it. From
are
the
you
state.
Undecided, basically, then?
I want to learn more about it, but I want to figure out if we can bury the whole thing, not just 71 miles.
All right. Back to the panel, Dan Toohey.
Thank you. Mr. Lawrence, without a full-service, full-time VA hospital in the state, how can you make sure that New Hampshire's veterans are getting the care they deserve?
Well, unfortunately, I don't believe the VA is doing a good job of making sure that the veterans are getting the health care that they deserve. Right now, we have a series of issues. 2 years ago, we talked about providing veterans the health care that they deserve, And we passed legislation in Washington, D.C. to fix that. Unfortunately, it's still broken. Our veterans are still waiting in line for the service they deserve, dying in line. And I think it's even more insulting as a veteran that Representative Custer voted against the Veterans Accountability Act, the very bill that was designed to bring accountability to the VA to ensure that this type of situation doesn't happen. So, we don't have a full-service VA center here in New Hampshire. We service them across the state in Vermont and across the state down in Massachusetts. That system seems to be working fairly well without a full service center here in New Hampshire. If our population grows, we should support legislation to build one.
Representative Flanagan.
I went to the Concerned Veterans for America luncheon recently, and when a middle-aged vet breaks down crying, explaining that he can't get medical care, we have a problem. The reality is the choice card is not working. The VA is not paying the bills. Hospitals are carrying these debts because the VA does not want competition. When I get elected to Washington, D.C., one of the first things I do is to make sure veterans get taken care of. Not only is it medical issues, but they also have issues as it relates to mental illness. That is, they're committing suicide 1 an hour because of their disabilities that they have that can't get adjudicated for long-term care. So no, veterans are not getting the service. The ones that give the most are getting the least when it comes to medical.
Candidates, thanks for the questions. Back to the panel. Allie Morris on perhaps the top issue facing the state, at least according to the voters in our latest poll.
So estimates say building a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border could cost billions of dollars. And considering the ongoing opioid crisis here, a fraction of that sum could make a real difference boosting addiction treatment here in New Hampshire. Would you prioritize building a wall over money for treatment? And we'll start with you, Representative Flanagan.
The physical wall that Donald Trump has been talking about, I don't know if it could ever come to fruition because of geography, the topography, and things like that. I think you're going to need, and we talked about this earlier as it relates to immigration, other factors to stop it. But there still needs to be a presence. So the assumption of your question is to take all that money to build that wall and use it for opioid treatment. And the reality is we've done a fairly good job at the state level to prioritize opioid the situation. We were a little late to the situation, but the fact that we have education to hope to stop it, we have the treatment piece, and we also have the law enforcement with the granite hammer. So I'm not sure if I agree with that assumption that we take the money from building the wall, because the wall won't be as large and as big of a project, I think, physically.
Mr. Lawrence.
I think I've already stated my position. I'm not in favor of building a wall across the 2,000-plus mile border in the southern part of the United States. My plan would be to build a wall of fence where practical, augment that with electronic countermeasures, and augment that with manpower. One of the main reasons why I advocate that approach is because it's much cheaper. We have to be realistic about what we can accomplish. That's a realistic way of solving this problem. And yes, to answer your question, some of the savings from my plan could be diverted to fighting the drug crisis that we now suffer under.
All right, thank you, candidates. If elected, your district will spread pretty far north for a topic on that. Folks who live up there, Dan Toohey.
Mr. Lawrence, what can you do immediately to help the economy in the North Country?
Well, the first and foremost thing I could do is get the government out of the way. The federal government, it's kind of ironic. I've toured businesses all across this district. I'm very proud to say that I was able to spend a lot of time with Whalen Engineering recently. And you know what all these businesses have in common? They don't talk about, fearing their competition or fearing price controls or having the appropriate labor force. They fear government regulation because it creates an unstable environment for them to be able to invest capital to grow, and it also prevents them from being able to realistically grow their business and be successful. The number one issue is government overregulation. So I would target government regulation to streamline regulation to enable the largest and most powerful economic engine we have, small business.
Let's go back to Facebook, social media for another question. This one's
Josh,
coming from Trinity.
Can I just touch on that one issue, because I have a thing.
My fault, so go right ahead.
I was the House sponsor of Senate Bill 250. John Gallus had introduced it, dealing with Ride the Wilds. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Ride the Wilds, but I was the first member from the House to endorse that bill. And what it has done is tripled and quadrupled some businesses, because we went up there again on a study committee to change the laws. Okay, recreation, natural resources, one of the strongest and powerful economic engine that the North Country has. We have people from Pennsylvania coming up there now, spending their money, spending at restaurants, hotels, gasoline, parts for their machines. So things like that, where you can look at what resources are needed and what type of businesses would benefit the community. Now the North Country has the potential to be a four-seasoned area.
All right, apologize for
No,
cutting
that's
off
okay,
there.
Josh.
All right, back to Facebook now. A question coming from Trinity. She wants to talk about minimum wage here. Do you support raising the federal minimum wage to $12 or $15 an hour so families can afford basic needs here in New Hampshire? Representative Flanagan.
No, I would endorse 25 or 50 cents increase, but the reality is the minimum wage is a wage that an employer pays for someone who doesn't have the skill background, like a young person, teenagers, things like that. We have so many different programs as it deals with education and training that if someone's making minimum wage in their jobs, they're not utilizing those programs. So, and there was a bill recently passed too that allowed businesses to provide daycare or time away from the job, which would help women. So they would actually keep their pay scale high or as high as men. So there are a lot of things we can do other than increasing it, but 25 or 50 cents, a nominal amount is fine, but the $12 and $15 will put more people out of work than it would be helping them.
Mr. Lawrence, same question.
No, I wouldn't be in favor of that. And the reason why is I don't believe Washington, D.C. is in a position to set the minimum wage for the entire country that would be appropriate. I believe that each state has that power currently, and I would allow each state to exercise that, because the minimum wage that's sufficient in California is not going to be the same as Louisiana or here in the great state of New Hampshire. So no, I wouldn't be an advocate of Washington, D.C. forming another overbearing federal mandate on the states, where the states are in a better position to make a prudent decision.
I see you waving over there, but
Just
we can't play by the rules.
State
Mr.
minimum wage. We don't have a state minimum wage.
No, we don't. Thanks for pointing that out. Next question coming from Adam.
After the 2008 economic meltdown, reforms were made to ensure that those big banks would not be too big to fail again. And unfortunately, 8 years later, those banks are bigger than ever, and if they failed, it would be as catastrophic as ever. Did Congress miss the mark when it bailed out those banks? And if a similar economic catastrophe happened again, would you vote to save them? We'll start with Mr. Lawrence.
I do believe Congress did miss the mark, and the biggest mark that they missed was actually the regulation that came out of that bailout. Unfortunately, they've put Americans and American businesses at a disadvantage now. Businesses can't get the capital that they need to grow. Individuals are now struggling with the regulatory process that denies them common sense opportunities to get capital to go to school, to buy a home. So yes, unfortunately, I think there were some missteps in Washington, D.C., and as a congressman, I would fight very hard to fix that.
But if there was another economic catastrophe, would you vote to bail out the banks?
No.
Mr. Flanagan.
You're talking about Dodd-Frank.
Well, not necessarily. There was the bailout vote itself.
Yeah, but I'm just saying ultimately what came about it was Dodd-Frank. And the reality is this country has gone from 8,000 banks to 6,000 banks. Small banks are closing almost every day in this country because they can't keep up with the regulations of Dodd-Frank. So the question then becomes do we let them go out of business because they made mistakes, or do we impose these onerous regulations and then put them out of business? And the reality is we needed some controls, but what we have with Dodd-Frank is wrong. Credit unions now are encroaching on banks too. There's a whole unintended consequences of Dodd-Frank, which is the solution to the problem that you're talking about, isn't working. So it's pick your poison.
But on the record, though, would you vote to bail out the banking system?
No, I wouldn't have bailed out General Motors, even though I drive a Chevy.
All right, thank you, candidates. Next question coming in. Allie Morris on the Affordable Care Act.
Do you think at this point it would do more harm than good to repeal the entire Affordable Care Act? And if you think the entire law can be repealed, what safeguards would you put in place to ensure that people's lives aren't interrupted? Representative Flanagan.
Thank you for the question, Ally. This is where I differ from Jim, is that I think it should be repealed. He thinks it should be amended. The reality is the House GOP in Washington have a market-driven plan, which is helped but with tax credits. All right? It's really about money. And the long and the short of the Affordable Care Act, the problems in talking to doctors and talking to medical device manufacturers, talking to the actual insurers with these large deductibles and large copays, it's not working. The insurance companies are losing money over this. It's going to self-implode anyway. But we can't just, take little bits and pieces here as Jim would like to do. The reality is we need to repeal it. We need to have a market-based system, and we need to get out of the government telling you what coverages you should and shouldn't have.
Mr. Lawrence.
I think it's funny that my opponent here thinks he knows my plan, because 2 years ago when I ran for Congress, I was strongly against Obamacare. I said I wanted to repeal it. I'm running once again on a candidacy that feels that Obamacare has damaged our healthcare system. It has made our healthcare more expensive, and it's limited options. And the only thing that I've ever said was that I want to repeal every part of this law that is damaging our healthcare system and replace it with something that makes sense, like allowing people to cross state lines to buy health insurance. One thing that I think is very critical here is that unfortunately Representative Flanagan hasn't always held that position. He ran strongly against expanded Medicare or expanded Obamacare as when he was running for elected office. Then when he was elected, he became one of its strongest proponents and actually voted for it. And now he's against it again. Another case of him talking tough to the voters and doing something else.
I think Mr. Lawrence was talking about expanded Medicaid, but feel free.
I mean, let's talk about his positions first on Obamacare.
You got about 30 seconds.
All right, GIR debate, the NH1 debate, and the UL editorial board, he came out saying that he wanted to basically chip away at the edges. As it relates to Medicaid expansion, it's not part of Obamacare. We already have Medicaid, and as a state legislator, and if he doesn't know this, he should know this, we can't go and unilaterally get rid of a federal law. Okay, the question is, do we take the tax money back that we've already given Washington, D.C. to make our people healthy? Do you want people suffering from cancer not to get treated?
You can't have it both ways, Jack. You just said you wanted to take a federal law away with Obamacare. And yes, you said it's expanded Medicaid. Expanded
That's not what I
Medicaid is a component of the Affordable Care Act.
Gentlemen, we are just about out of time. We have one more question before we get to our closing statement. This one talks about party unity. You both belong to a party that a lot of people believe are broken over different areas, like Medicaid expansion, a lot of different division. And leaders in the Republican Party think that's costing you elections. So what is your vision for the future of a different kind of Republican Party, Mr. Flanagan?
George Hoyt hit it right on the nail. It's that these ideologies people have as it relates to, I say this to people, I says, if you want the best candidate you can vote for, just look in the mirror. Because what you see is the best candidate. And I think Ronald Reagan was right, and I hate quoting dead presidents, is the reality is if we're on the same team 80% of the time, then we should be getting along fine. And I think that's what I've tried to do up in Concord and the 6 years that I've been there.
All right, same question for you, Mr. Lawrence.
Well, I do believe that it's very important for us to work together to get anything accomplished. You know, being a part of a large legislative body, it takes a big coalition to move or make progress. So as a result, I think it's very important that we highlight the things that unite us, work together, focus on the priorities, the issues that the voters are facing in this state every day. I think everybody can agree. We understand that our economy is sluggish. We want to improve our economy. We need to fix Washington's spending problem. We need to keep Americans safe because we're suffering under the worst foreign policy in decades. Our allies don't feel like they can depend on us, and our enemies certainly don't fear us. These are the important issues to the voters, and as long as we focus on that together, we can accomplish great things.
Donald Trump good for the Republican Party?
He's the nominee. I support him over Hillary Clinton. We're gonna do everything in our power to make sure that we move America forward and not backwards.
All right, same question.
I think he's getting better. I honestly believe, I think what he's he's learning being a politician now. He's no longer a businessman. He's learning the hard way, but I think he's getting better. So I'm hoping that he is good for the party.
All right, fair enough. Now it is time to end the debate with your closing statements. And going first is Mr. Lawrence.
I'm running for Congress because Washington is broken. Representative Custer has been allowed to sit down on the job for far too long. I was fortunate to graduate from the United States Air Force Academy. And now it's time for me to pay the American people back for the leadership training that they gave me. I ask tonight for your support. I ask tonight for your vote. I ask tonight for you to stand with me so that I can go to Washington and vote for you, the voters of the great state of New Hampshire. Thank you.
Your closing statement, Representative Flanagan.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you, WMUR, and all the moderators and the
Panelists.
What's that?
Panelists. Go.
Panelists, thank you. CD2, congratulations, it needs a new congressperson. Annie Kuster, we can do better than Annie Kuster. She's ineffective. She's really only passed one bill in 4 years, which is the renaming of the FAA Center. The trouble is, Jim, his record is not much better than Annie's. He's been ineffective in Concord. And if you do vote for Jim, it would be basically guaranteed that Annie Kuster would be having another 2 years. What we really need is someone who can get the job done. And I have the skills, knowledge, and the passion to get it done. I want to balance the budget. I want to repeal Obamacare. I want to create jobs. The thing about Washington is if you send the right people there, you can get things done. I'm that person. Ask for your vote on September 13th. Jack Flanagan for Congress, Tuesday, September 13th.
Well, best of luck to both of you on election night. Thank you very much for participating in our debate. That is going to wrap up things here with Republican candidates for the 2nd Congressional District. Tomorrow, we'll be looking at the 1st Congressional District. Republicans running are Rich Ashew and the incumbent Frank Ginton. Of course, you can go to WMUR.com and our mobile app anytime for complete in-depth political coverage that only News 9 can provide. But for now, I'm Josh McKelvin. For myself and our panelists, thanks for joining us tonight. See you back here again tomorrow. Be safe and have a great night.